In this video, I'm going to be talking about birth trauma, and particularly the birth trauma that was caused as a result of the pandemic, mainly during 2020 and 2021. If you've experienced this, then please heed my trigger warning that it may feel uncomfortable at times, and therefore either don't watch or just turn off or just whatever it is. Just make sure that you take care of yourself. So just for a bit of context, for those who don't know me, my name's Sophie Harris and I'm a postpartum therapist, and I regularly help new mums recover from the impact of birth trauma. On my Instagram page, Looking After Mum, I recently shared this post, and when I shared this post, I was literally staggered by the response. It was shared by hundreds of people sharing their experiences of having a traumatic birth and the pain that was caused by giving birth, mainly due to the restrictions that were put in place of a lot of women either having to give birth completely alone sometimes or being separated from their partners or their families after childbirth. So you may or may not know that during this time, due to the pandemic, many new mums were separated from partners at various times of their birth. There were often arbitrary rules put in place around by this many centimetres dilated, a partner can or can't be there. Sometimes partners were just allowed in for the birth and then asked to leave after the birth, or sometimes partners were allowed to visit after the birth on the hospital ward. Other times it was just for 1 or 2 hours per day. And for many new mums during this time, this has had an absolutely devastating impact on their start of motherhood. When you become a mum, you can argue that it is the biggest emotional, physical, mental, spiritual transition that you will ever go through, and you are at your very most vulnerable and raw. And this means that you need support and you need the love of those around you. There will be a few women who choose to give birth alone, but that is extremely different to what I'm talking about, of people who want support there but aren't able to have it. I've heard so many stories of people's awful experiences during this time. If we cast our minds back to 2020, March, April 2020, when things were really heightened back then, and I have spoken to so many women who gave birth during this time where they were really scared of what was happening. Staff often seemed scared of them, and the staff were understandably not wanting to catch the virus at the time. But this meant that I've spoken to people who've been left in wards on their own, left in rooms not checked on, their partners weren't allowed in, and they were just made to give birth alone, and sometimes with complications, sometimes not, but regardless, this is just such awful practice for new mums and the needs that you have during this time. During birth, a woman needs support, and so if you go into birth with your fight or flight response triggered, your anxiety response triggered, your fear of being alone, your fear of abandonment, this is going to be so unhelpful for your birth. You may have found that you felt scared, that you're wondering where your partner was, that you didn't know what was happening. And this is the least helpful thing that we could give to birthing women, mothers during this time. And for some really unfortunate people, you may have heard the worst news or experienced tragedy through hearing about loss or miscarriage during this time. And this alone would be such an awful thing to go through, even with someone by you. But going through that alone, the impact of that is even greater, and the impact that it has on your life. And regardless of whether you went through specific traumatic experiences, the majority of women giving birth during this time would have been separated from their partners at least after birth, and maybe partner or family member was asked to leave half an hour after giving birth. And this in itself has such a deep impact. For many mothers, they have undergone complex births, undergone C-sections. C-sections and other birth interventions are really normalised in today's society, but they have such a huge impact on your body. And often we can't move around, we can't function properly. We're literally at our physically, mentally, emotionally most vulnerable. And this is the time where we need people. So if we take partners or caregivers away, you are left alone. And the impact of that, whilst caring for a brand new baby, is just so profound. And often, from what I understand, hospital wards weren't given extra staff to make up for the lack of partners and the work that the partners would do. All of that informal stuff that a partner would do on the ward. And so therefore the wards naturally became understaffed. I would imagine the people trying to work on these staff were trying to do it in such difficult situations anyway. And so therefore these mothers are literally just left without enough support. Things like trying to tend to a crying baby but not being able to reach them. I've heard of somebody who had a call bell just left out of reach and their baby was crying but they couldn't reach anyone. And it's such a small action, but it makes such a huge impact to someone's complete sense of isolation, abandonment. And so the long-term impact that I've seen so far is people with fear of abandonment, a fear of being left alone, feeling like they're not good enough because they were put in a situation where they were made to not feel good enough. Starting motherhood in this way has triggered their fight or flight response. So this response of fear, of scarcity, this feeling of something going wrong, this fear of being left alone, of not being looked after. And so the anxiety that causes as you take into motherhood, plus alongside that, the impact that this would have had secondarily on, say, a mum's ability to feed without adequate support given to her, without being able to reach the services that you would have done normally. All of this makes such a huge impact on your mothering experience. I know of many new mums who don't want to look at photos of their birth because it reminds them and terrifies them, and they get such an anxiety response just from looking at photos of that time. Or others who just cannot go near the hospital, if it was a hospital where you gave birth, and just the idea of going back to that hospital feels terrifying, feels horrifying, and that is not okay. That's not the way that we should be feeling having given birth in that place. Birth is such a sacred and potentially such a beautiful experience, and it is just so sad that so many of us have experienced births during this time with those rights and liberties being taken away. Birth is such a sacred and potentially beautiful experience. It's just so sad that so many of us have had such a difficult experience as we enter motherhood, as we go through that immense transition of what it takes to become a mum and to give birth. And it breaks my heart to think of all of the mothers who are feeling like they're not good enough, that they've done something wrong, that they're failing. I'd say one of the most common experiences that I hear is, why didn't I say this? Why didn't I go home? Why didn't I stop this? And it is just so heartbreaking to think that as a woman, as a mother, we tend to blame ourselves for situations that actually there's nothing that we could have done about, and just how heartbreaking that is, and that faulty thinking, that blaming yourself is not accurate. So why am I choosing to speak about this now? Because clearly there's nothing that we can really do about what happened during the years of 2020 and 2021. But I would say that mothers have never had their experiences validated. No one's apologized. No one said, oh, that sounds really tough. At most, we tend to get things like, oh, at least you've got a healthy baby. Oh, it wasn't that bad. But it completely underplays the massive, huge impact that has had on so many people. If you have been experienced by this, I just want you to say that you're so definitely not alone. Although I won't share any of the experiences on my YouTube that people have shared on my Instagram post, but you're welcome to visit my Instagram page, Looking After Mum, where the post is pinned to the top of the page, and just read about some of the other people's experiences of what happened to them during birth. Also, organisations like the Birth Trauma Association provide free peer support for people who have experienced a traumatic birth to help you understand that other people are going through it and get that support from your peers who have been through something similar. And also, therapists like myself work with people who've experienced birth trauma regularly, and if you would like support from someone like myself, then you're welcome to reach out for help. If you're interested in learning more about birth trauma, then you can watch my video about how to understand if you are experiencing birth trauma and the signs and symptoms of birth trauma, which will be displayed just here.